Hi Spring fans, welcome to another installment of Spring Tips. In this installment, we're going to take a sort of a different look, a different approach. We're going to talk about something that, probably we wouldn't have normally talked about. You wouldn't normally think about doing this with Spring, but it's an option and it works, and I thought it was quite an interesting mix, so we're going to do it. We're going to talk about how to integrate Spring, that is to say Spring Boot, with JavaFX. Now, you ask, why JavaFX? Well, there's a few reasons. First of all, when JavaFX first came out, JavaFX, of course, for those of you who aren't in the know, is a component library. It's a UI framework. It's a UI toolkit based on this idea of a stage, or a scene, and a scene has a components inside of it. But it's also got this sense of a timeline, so you can use it to do really interesting things, like animation, right? And technically it's a sort of a more advanced, more interesting application development technology than something like, for example, base Swing. Recently, in Java 11, it has been divorced from the core Java sort of runtime. So it's no longer bundled. It's actually now separately available as Maven dependencies. And as a result, it's got a whole new life, right? It can move independent of the release cadence of the JDK itself. And there's this, I've just seen over the years a lot of really interesting use cases. People use it to do visualizations, right? You see all these really great demos with respect to medical imaging or astronomy and general physics simulations, all these kinds of really interesting things that I think really speak to why you would want to use this, right? You can produce some very, very beautiful things, multimedia rich user interfaces. And in order for that to work, these things need to talk to services. They need to talk to backends. And here, especially in light of the reactive programming paradigm that Spring Framework 5 and all the technologies that build upon its support, we have a really interesting option, right? Spring is a natural link. It provides, for example, a reactive web client for HTTP-based services and a WebSocket client. I mean, these things are a natural match for client-side applications. You can use the Spring Framework web support, the reactive web support, in a client application and just tell it not to run a web server. And there you go. You have access to all these very convenient things like the web client, for example. So while we're not going to talk about the reactive web client today specifically, we're going to talk about how to build a utterly boring stock standard sort of JavaFX application, and how to hoist up a Spring application context in the sort of life cycle of a JavaFX application. So let's do that. Let's go to our normal go-to spot. We'll go to start.spring.io here. And we're just going to build a new application, just as we always do. We're going to build a simple JavaFX. Okay, so JavaFX. And, as you can imagine, we're going to use Lombok, maybe bring in the reactive web support. I'm going to use 2.10 RC1. I'm going to switch to the full version and give myself Java 11. I'm running Java 11. You can use Java, or you can use earlier versions of Java, but those versions will include JavaFX. So in theory, there might have been some drift between what's possible in Open JavaFX, Open JFX, which is what I'm going to use here, versus what's core and bundled into the JVM, into the Java runtime. And by the way, that JavaFX it's not a part of the spec. It's never been, consistently deployed across all Java runtimes anyway, right? It's I know that, for example, Oracle JDK has had JavaFX, but that's not necessarily true of OpenJDK, for example. So it's nice that these things are now separate, that you can choose to install them if you like, and there's no worries about how it works. And also, Spring has this really nice, convenient sort of so-called fat jar mechanism for distribution that I think is a nice fit when you want to build simple but useful client-side applications. In a previous installment of Spring Tips, we looked at how to build Spring Shell-based CLI applications. So consider this the sort of, Windows for Workgroups version of that discussion, right? How do you build user interfaces with Spring? And we've done this before. We've actually looked at other UI toolkits, right? We've actually looked at web frameworks, for example, in previous installments. So this isn't entirely out of the blue. Okay, let's see. We're gonna go start up our application, UA JavaFX.zip, as usual. And when that spins up, we're gonna it'll open up in our IDE, or trusty IDE here. And I'm using IntelliJ, and again, lots of good choices here. NetBeans in particular is a great choice because it has a really good, rock solid integrated support for JavaFX. IntelliJ, at least as far as I know, in the Ultimate Edition, has very good JavaFX support as well. I'm not sure about the Community Edition, but it wouldn't surprise me. So you might well check that out. Okay, so first things first. In order for us to get anywhere with this, we need JavaFX, right? That's pretty fair. So let's import, or rather use a number of libraries here. So we're gonna use JavaFX controls, and this will require org.openJFX. Okay, and we need to bring in the right version, which corresponds to 11. That's the JDK we're using. And I'm just going to bring in a number of things here. We don't need them all, certainly, but it's nice to have them. So we want the controls, which are the widgets, or at least some of the widgets. And there's a huge ecosystem of third-party widgets, controls, UI elements, whatever you want to call them, at your disposal, at your fingertips. And I encourage you to peruse that larger community, because there are some really interesting things that build upon this. We're going to bring in the graphics support here. We're going to bring in the base support. And FXML is the two-way user interface markup language that supports binding to user interface elements. So you can describe your layout in a static sort of hierarchical structure, and then have those elements mapped to Java objects, and those objects can then be manipulated in Java code. So you can do the layout and design in XML, which is a natural use of XML, and then articulate the behavior in Java code. So what happens when somebody clicks on the button, or when the window loads, or whatever. Okay, so there's our simple Maven build, and that's it. That's really all that we need. We have the web support on the class path, but we don't need it. So I'm going to say none, right? Just disable the web server. And now we're going to build a simple application. Now, there's a little bit of a problem here, right? There's a little bit of an impedance between how JavaFX wants to work and how Spring wants to work. Spring normally, as you can see here, is sort of front and center. It's the thing that hoists the rest of your application into existence. With JavaFX, it's not so easy to do that, or rather, it's the path of least resistance is to, first of all, bootstrap JavaFX, and then let JavaFX bootstrap your Spring application. Okay, so we're going to write as little as we can outside of Spring, but we're going to write just enough to instantiate and install Spring, and then we're going to write code to integrate the two so that one talks to the other, and so that when, for example, JavaFX needs a reference to a controller or a component, it looks to beans that are being managed by Spring. Okay, so first things first, our Spring Boot application, our public static void main, is actually going to use the JavaFX application class. Okay, so there you go, .launch. And in order for it to launch, it needs a pointer to a class which extends application. So we're going to call this our JavaFX application. Oops. Oh, yes. Okay, so let's see. Let's just call this new class Beautiful FX application. This will be our Spring Boot entry point. And it'll have this code as well. Okay, and this will be our actual JavaFX application. Okay, so we're going to say extends application, and we have to implement the minimum required interface, the contract here. It's an abstract type, so we implement start. We're going to come back to that in a second. And here we'll say that we want JavaFX application.class to be launched with these arguments, and that's it. That's the basic arrangement. Now you're going to see that from within our JavaFX application class, we're going to reference BeautifulFX application. So these both need to be public. They both need to be visible to each other, and I find that a bit disappointing. In some examples that you'll see online, you'll see that they have the Spring Boot application, public static void main, the JavaFX launch, and the Spring Boot stuff all in the same code base. But for reasons I don't quite understand yet, I gather that this somehow checks that the class it's running in is also the same one that is the application, and it does something where it looks for a certain Java module from Jigsaw, from the JPMS, right? The Java module system, right? And once that's there, if it's detected, then it needs a certain thing to be explicitly made available. Well, I'm running this in class path mode. There's no module path, so that check seems arbitrary to me, if I'm honest. I don't know why it's there, and it doesn't really help us at all. But as a result, I found that if I just tease these two parts out into two separate classes, everything just works. Okay, so we'll just leave it like that because, all told, it's certainly a lot easier than not being able to do what we want to do, right? So, okay, we have our JavaFX application. What is our JavaFX application going to do? Well, it has to boot, doesn't it? It has to be the thing that hoists Spring into existence. And we're going to do so in terms of the application lifecycle. So let's say we have a class, a pointer to a configurable application context, right? And there's our context, and that context is the Spring application context that we're going to initialize when the application, the JavaFX application, springs to life, right? So let's override this method, init. And in the init method, we're going to say this dot context equals new Spring application builder dot sources let's see, BeautifulFX application dot class dot initializer, and we're going to need an initializer, and the reason is because I want to programmatically register some beans. Okay, so we could do this a number of different ways, but as you'll see, since I'm trying to involve objects that are already created and that exist outside of the Spring application context, we're going to use the programmatic bean definition syntax that's available in Spring Framework 5. Here we're going to get our parameters, but we're going to get our parameters from JavaFX, right? So JavaFX already has those parameters. We already gave it to it. So here, in order to make sure that all of Spring has access to those command line arguments, we're going to pass them in here. And now we need to create an application context initializer. So we looked at this in a previous installment of Spring Tips. We looked at functional bean definitions. So you might want to review that, but this is still pretty simple either way. So initializer equals new application context initializer. And here we're going to programmatically register a few beans, aren't we? So AC, and we're going to say AC dot register a bean. Now, which bean do we want? Well, I want to make the application itself available for injection and for reference in other places. So I'll say I want to reference this, basically. Okay. Well, I suppose we can do JavaFX application dot this. There we are. It's a little bit easier. What else do we want? We want the parameters themselves, and again, we could reference them from the application itself, I suppose, but let's just make them explicitly available. And finally, we want the host services. Now, the host services provides things like the ability to resolve references relative to the code base and to launch operating system specific browsers, right? URLs and browsers. So very, very convenient thing to have a reference to. There's our initializer, and we're just going to pass that in here. So what that's going to do is it's going to say to Spring, here are 3 beans of type application, parameters, and host services. In order to, we whenever somebody wants to inject them, give them the reference returned to you from this supplier, which we're describing in terms of a lambda. All right, when that starts up, it's going to run the init method, and this is a great place to do any kind of work that does not run on the user interface thread. So any kind of stuff that you want to do to, prepare the application to begin to load, you would do here. In this case, we're using it as an enviable place to instantiate Spring and the application context and so on. And the converse of that, the opposite end of that, is the stop method. Okay, so I'm going to say stop, and here we'll say this.context.close and platform.exit. There we are. Very good. Now we see the start method. The start method is pretty useful. This is the callback that you get when the application is ready, right? When it's ready, when it's time to start building up your user interface. And you could do all that work here, but that would be in this application class that is not, you can't benefit from any injection and so on, any of the services that Spring provides. So what I like to do here is to instead publish an event, publish event, and the event, I guess, will just be a stage ready event. It's an application event, application context event, right? And the job is fairly, the description, the work is fairly straightforward. We're going to pass in the stage, and we could even be more explicit about that. We could say, okay, public stage, get stage, okay, and return this dot source. All right, or even better, suppose I could have just stored a pointer to it, but why? Right, we've already got that. Okay, so I'm going to throw that event, new stage ready event, primary stage. Now all Spring components that express an interest in listening for this event will be able to listen to it and initialize the stage or contribute to the stage and whenever they want to, and they can do so in terms of beans that are managed by Spring, which is good. Okay, so I think that's it. I think that's enough for that. That's a very, very simple sort of integration there for JavaFX and for Spring. Now we have to build something that actually listens to that event, I suppose. So let's go back over here and configure the application a little bit. Let's build something that actually works with that stage. Okay, so we'll go here, stage initializer or application application runner, I don't know, stage listener. Okay, there we go. We'll just call that. Very, very sort of straightforward. And this is going to implement application listener, listening for the stage ready event. Implementing this method. And there we are. There's our callback. Now we can do whatever we want, and this is a Spring Bean after all. So let's say add component, and what we're going to do is we're going to build the user interface, and we're going to do so by giving it a title. So let's say title or application title, and this is the thing I would have externalized, so I can take advantage of Spring's ability to externalize strings into properties or message resource bundles. So I'm going to say spring.application.ui.title, and let's see, you okay, computer? All right. So there's that. Now copy and paste. What? What's going on? Okay, that was bizarre. Hopefully this is fixed. I've just updated to the latest and greatest macOS Mojave, so I wonder if that's causing this oddness when recording. Okay, back to this. Okay, so we've got now our JavaFX application, and we've got our beautiful application. Goody. All right, so there's that, and now we're going to process the data on the application properties. I'm going to give it a title, which will glean from here. So I'm going to call this beautiful JavaFX. All right, there's our basic application. And now what I want to do is I want to actually, with the stage that we've gotten from this event, I'm going to say stage ready event dot get stage. What I want to do is I want to load my user interface. So I could manually, programmatically with Java objects build up a user interface hierarchy and build up the widgets and then all that stuff in Java code. But it's far more useful and far more productive, especially for sort of forms and analytical type applications like this, to just do it using FXML. Right? This is the JavaFX XML markup language. So we're going to say file UI.fxml. We'll load that, and we'll come back to that in a second. But for now, because we want to be able to reference that, we need to have a pointer to the resource. So private final resource fxml. Resource, of course, is an abstraction in core Spring that allows us to represent things that with which we can do input and output, right? So class path / UIFXML. Okay, so we can tell Spring to find that resource and inject it as a constructor argument for us. And then we say this dot fxml equals resource. Very good. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say we want to get the URL. So URL this dot fxml dot get URL. Okay. So goody. Now we have our URL. Let's load the definition. So fxml loader, like that, and we're going to say URL dot. Oh, that's it. Actually, we'll just pass in URL, and then we're going to use the fxml loader to set the controller factory. So the question now is, what is the fxml going to do when it needs an object that's been referenced in the fxml declarations? And we'll see what that means in a second. So for example, suppose we have a user interface with a controller type, a class that gets involved in the sort of functionality, the backing functionality for a user interface. Well, it has to find an object that matches a certain class. So the contract is here. The contract here is given a class, return an object. Well, of course, what does that sound like? That sounds like one of those things that Spring could do really well for us. So we're going to say that we need a pointer to the application context, right? So we're going to get a reference to that application context, and we can do that just by injecting it, actually, right? It's just a regular Spring bean, so we'll say application context. Okay. Alrighty. So it's there. We're going to say return ac.getBean a class. Alrighty. Now there's our lambda, and with that, we should be able to load the application. So I'm going to say load, and I'm going to ask for the parent widget that comes back, the root widget, as the return value, and we can stash that, or we can just use it. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use it to create a scene. So use scene, passing in the root, giving it a width and a height of, let's say, 600 by 600 pixels. And then I'm going to say stage.set the scene, stage.set the title. We've got that title that we've injected, so might as well use it. Stage.set, just show, right? I want to show the stage now. All right, so there we go. That's our application. That's how we're going to build the user interface. We still actually haven't built the user interface, have we? So let's do that right here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to build a user interface one of two ways. We could do this. We could use the scene builder, which I think is a fine way to go, right? So ours is, ours couldn't be more trivial. So let's actually, we could just drag and drool. Or there we are. So you can see it's arguably more efficient just to do that. Okay, so we want to build a VBox, and in the box we'll have a button, controls. All right, and a label. Okay, now go back to this, and we should have a VBox, although I don't really know that we need this children element. Okay, and we need to give our widgets some IDs. That way we can sort of connect them to the user, to the Java objects in the backend controller, which we also need to specify. So we need to specify a number of things here. So first of all, IDs, fx ID button, fx ID label. All right, and then with that done, we need to specify a controller. So let's build a controller here. Okay, and a controller is just a bean that Spring's going to involve, or that JavaFX is going to involve, as I say. So that bean will be, simple. What is this? UI, simple UI controller. All right, and it's just a regular Spring object, just nothing fancy at all. When Spring, we're going to tell this to delegate to that class. That's going to result in a call to the connection factory that we've contributed somewhere. Here, the controller factory that's going to resolve beans for us. So, we could arguably make this a little bit more, we could name it a little bit better. Application context, very good. All right, so there's our application. And there's our widgets, our simple controller. And what's going to happen when this controller gets started? Well, we have to have a place to stash these references. So let's go ahead and build a simple controller using the fxml annotation. So go to our simple UI controller, and our application is going to be the trivialest of trivial, right? We're going to say public, and unfortunately there is no constructor injection. You don't need, strictly speaking, this annotation if you're using public fields, as I am right now. But if you decide to do a private field, which for some reason doesn't, now that I've spent so many years not doing it in Spring, I'd very much like to avoid private fields that I can't get at to. I can't influence through testing and through collaborating objects that are passing through the constructor. I'd very much like to avoid that, so I'll just use public types instead. So public button. Okay. And finally, I want to process. So we have the initializing bean callback interface in Spring. Well, same kind of principle applies. After these have been bound by JavaFX, not by Spring, even though the bean itself is being managed by Spring, after they're bound, I want to be able to process and work with them. So I'm going to say here, this button set on action listener, and I'm given an event. And what I'm going to do in the event is I'm just going to let's write some text. Okay, so let's announce in the label the document base of the code. In order to get the document base, I need the host services, and we already created that pointer earlier, didn't we? So host services, good, and get document base. All right. Alrighty, good. So there's that. Okay, so there's our simple demo. And you can see, it's Spring, right? All the stuff this is gonna work. This is gonna be injected through Spring, Lifecycle methods, all that kind of stuff will be injected. The only classes where you shouldn't be able to, where you shouldn't take for granted the availability of Spring is this one, right? That's it. Everything else in this application is a Spring bean. So this is why I would just get this right once and just not touch it. Just hide it somewhere, reuse it, put it in a jar, etc. Okay. And what else do we want? Let's say throw new runtime exception, because we do have a framework that can help us catch these errors if there are any. All right. All right. I think we're in a good place. Let's try it. Let's try it out, huh? So let's go ahead and run it. Okay, so there's a button. If you click on it, it shows us the code base, location, the actual document base. Now, we haven't even really begun to scratch the surface here. We've got infinite number of things that we could do, but hopefully you've got an appreciation for what's possible at this point, right? By using these things together, we can build user interfaces that are dynamic, that have tables and charts and grids and so on, and they can move quickly, and they can support real-time sort of 3D graphics and rendering, and so you can do all sorts of really interesting visualizations. If nothing else, consider this as something to power your observability sort of use cases, your goals, your visualizations, that kind of thing. There's a lot we haven't talked about here. Obviously, I wish I could have spent a little bit more time looking at the web client or the or indeed technologies like RSocket, right? I mean, you could use RSocket to connect this to a backend, and that backend, of course, would be powered by Spring and the reactive web framework, or reactive Spring WebFlex, or you could use RSocket, or you could use web services, HTTP REST APIs. You could do whatever you want, right, in the backend. But the benefit is that we now have kind of a like-for-like experience on both client and service. Oh, and of course, this is Spring, so if you go to the Spring Boot build here, configuration, executable, true, and then you go to the command line, and the command line will go to the project itself, cd downloads JavaFX, do maven clean package, what did we get there? Oh yeah, my test doesn't see the host services, so for now, we'll just skip the test. That's an easy fix, but let's skip tests. All we have to do is to tell our test framework that we have those functional bean definitions, which it doesn't see otherwise. Okay, and we go to target. And remember, we have not just an executable fat jar, right? Look at that, we have that, but we can just execute it like that, right? // Okay, there we go. All right, my friends, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see.